My name is Kelly, and I just finished my master's degree here at UWM in music history and library and information science. And this past semester, I was working on a project scanning and digitizing items from the Leo Kottke archives and writing metadata records for it as well, which proved to be a much more complicated endeavor than I anticipated. Most of the images that I use are the scans that I created, and the slides that do have images on them, I tried to incorporate a little bit of my metadata record just so you could see that I did do that work, in case we run out of time to actually talk about the record specifically. So, Leo Kottke is a guitarist. He's very influential, especially here at UWM's guitar department, because of his skill as a performer and a composer. Revolutionized what we now call fingerstyle guitar. And especially his second album, 6 and 12-string guitar, was extremely popular and successful and went a long way in legitimizing the steel string guitar as an artistic, serious, solo concert instrument. So you can imagine the guitarists here on campus are very invested in collecting things that have to do with his career. And the Leo Kottke Archives, right now, it's a very informal repository. It's not been institutionalized yet. It pretty much just lives in the house of the director of the fingerstyle guitar department, John Stropes. But I was able to work with about 40, 50, 60 items, I think, approximately 60, and scanning them and writing the metadata records for them. I'm going to talk a little bit about just general issues of ethics in digital archives. And one thing that I found really interesting was how the role of the artist and their philosophical view is very similar to the role an archivist takes in practice and in philosophy as well. So I'd like to talk a little bit about those two side by side. And then specifically this composition of Leo Kottke error proofing is a good example of how complicated musical works are to catalog, specifically because of the different manifestations that they can come in. And then if we have time, we'll look at some specific metadata records. Roberta Brody, in a 2003 article, defines ethics as an action intended to achieve an objective in a way that doesn't violate a value. And I like this definition because it emphasizes action. It's a behavior that we conduct. But she doesn't focus on good and bad behavior so much. She points out the value, some value that we hold that we don't want to violate or that we want to uphold. And she talks about how metadata itself contains implicit and explicit values of its creator in the same way information in general contains implicit and explicit values of its creator. And that's one of the similarities I see between the artist and the archivist, is how they represent their values through the things, the symbols that they're creating. So up here on the slide, I have 4 values that information specialists would probably all agree that these are ethical things that we all want to try to follow when we practice knowledge organization. I think ethical conflict gets introduced when these values conflict with each other. For example, if you are trying to represent an item that might violate the creator's privacy or their intellectual property, these are things that we all wrestle with, I'm sure, when we have to deal with how to represent items. Some specific difficulties in digital archiving include the role of the archivist. One of their values is to maintain the original order of their collections and the provenance. And one way that they do that is to have these hierarchical arrangements of the collection. And that can conflict with the way metadata is organized as an item level description of items. So how do you represent, how can you bring both of those together in the digital environment is one thing that can be kind of tricky when you're dealing with archival materials. So the artist is a figure who's creating art, and some of the values that underlie what they end up creating are, we call aesthetics, right? They're philosophy behind why they're making art. One word that's a little bit complicated to unpack in music history is this idea of authenticity. There was a movement for a while, about 20 years ago, of performance practice where people wanted to go back to playing period instruments from like the Baroque period, like the harpsichord for Johann Sebastian Bach's music, and they felt like this was a more authentic representation of the composer's intention. And now we sort of feel like that it's a good thing to try to endeavor to authentically represent the composer, but it's not necessarily something that we can achieve. So that word authentic is a little bit tricky for music. But I see it as being a very similar thing to what information specialist does with fair representation. You're trying to authentically represent an item. So what we get in creating records for artistic cultural works is a symbol of real life and a symbol of that. So symbols on symbols keep building up. And I find that a really interesting process. The artist and the archivist is also very interested in getting the work out, making it accessible, dissemination, making your work known. And they're also very invested in controlling how this is used. The artist for financial or artistic reasons, and the archivist to protect the intellectual property of the artist. In addition to being a musician, Leo Kottke is also very interested in literature, so I did a little bit of reading in ethics and literary criticism and theory, and these were a couple of quotes I found. The second one I'll unpack a little bit. Is on one hand we say, or used to say, the artist should hold up ideals for imitation. He should inspire all humanity to certain qualities of action. And this is a very, very ancient idea that art should inspire proper behavior for mankind, for humanity. Dating back to Plato's Republic, he talks about we should only play music in the Dorian mode because that's going to inspire people to be good citizens. Today we don't really think along those lines so much, but that's an idea, an ethical idea in music that's been around for a while. On the other hand, the artist today is often considered interesting mainly for his oddity. And I think this is an interesting juxtaposition of the artist as an individual and the needs of the artist versus the rest of society. One of the things that we value in musicians oftentimes is their virtuosity, how skillful they are really sets them apart from the ordinary person. And also their performing ability, their charisma, makes us very engaged with their art and what they're doing. Or perhaps, as John Gardner says here, their oddity, if they're very eccentric or curious people, we're often very engaged in watching them perform. So I'd like to show you a real brief clip of Leo Kottke himself talking about his compositional method. And he's going to play a little bit of this tune, Airproofing, while he's talking. So hopefully this will work.
Can't use the vocabulary to tell you what I'm up to. But it's basically happy accidents. And if you're really trying to think of something, it's a harder way to write. And what I'm trying to do when I think my way through a piece is get to the same place I get to when I stupid my way through a tune. You want it to flow,
a brief clip of a lecture he did here in the recital hall at UWM in 1987. And the guitar department here has been keeping video records for the past, how long has it been, John? 30 years, 20 years? Since 87 at least. So you can get a kind of a picture of how much material they have in their collection that needs to be organized. So a couple of uses that the archive has at the moment is to create a notational system for teaching fingerstyle guitar. And this is where the guitar department here is kind of on the cutting edge of research, is this notation to learn to play these songs hasn't been invented yet. So they've basically been inventing their own systems for how to teach people how to read and learn to play this music. This is an example of airproofing. And the difference you can see between standard notation is on the very top line, if anyone is familiar with standard musical notation. And then the second line of each three of these staves is a guitar tablature. And the difference between the two is the standard notation tells you what the notes are, what the pitches are, what the rhythm is, what it's going to sound like when you play it. The tablature tells you the 6 lines are the strings of the guitar, so it actually tells you how to play it. So this type of sheet music is pretty unique to the guitar, and it's able to convey information on how to play the guitar that standard notation can't convey. And here's another example of the way that the guitar department uses their resources to teach. So just a very brief excerpt from airproofing. Slow down a lot. That's the right hand technique to learn what he's doing with his right hand. And there's the left hand. And I like this next one because it shows you how long Leo Kottke has been playing the song, and again, how much video footage is lying around that needs to be organized.
A little more damping, a little more time.
So musical works are not necessarily fixed items in the way that a book or another artifact or object is. They keep changing a lot, and one of the things that we can keep track of with how they change is the title. This is the later version, Airproofing 2 of the song. And here's just a chart that shows how much the song has changed. In the very beginning, it was sort of a brief, smaller composition, but then 15 years later, Leo Kottke adds all of the stuff in the middle, new sections, and then another 15 years later, he gets rid of the G section and adds an H section. So these are, music in the oral tradition, it changes and morphs a lot. And this is something that you have to keep in mind when you want to co-locate things that are the same work, but you also want to differentiate the different versions that we have here. And here's yet another version. This is a conductor score, which is, a score is different than sheet music because it shows you, what it actually shows you. It shows you all of the parts that are playing at the same time. So Leo Kottke and collaborated with a composer and conductor to create a guitar concerto version of several of his songs, a suite of his compositions. Airproofing is one of them. Oh, I skipped it. And this is the first page of the conductor score for airproofing that shows what all the other instruments are doing. And here is the program for the symphony performance, the first premiere of the guitar concerto, and a little bit of a clip of the end of Airproofing, just so you can get a sense of how putting it in a different instrumental context changes the sound, even though it's still the same work. Could you tell that was the same song? It's a bit different. And this is photographs. The next couple slides are photographs of Leo Kottke with the conductor and the arranger of the concerto. And I like to use these as an example to take a look at how I tried to design the metadata schema. And the items, the fields that I feel are the most interesting to look at are, we talked a little bit about this yesterday, the title and the creator. For example, how do you come up with a title for a photograph that doesn't have a title? And this involves the idea of naming, which I think is really interesting. Naming is a really powerful and important tool to locate things, and historically, philosophically, theologically, the problem of ontology and naming things has been around for a while. My first experience with ontology was in a theology class where we talked about the names of God, so those are obviously very powerful. For example, ancient Egyptian religions, they believed that if you knew the true name of a god, you could control the god. Let's see, another example is Moses at the burning bush. He kept asking God, who was trying to talk to him through this burning bush, what's your name? You know, who are you? How do I trust you? And God eventually said, I am that I am. So he didn't admit to having a name, but he emphasized that his being, his or her being, whatever viewpoint that you take, was the important part of the essence of God. So titles. How do we find a title that doesn't have one? Is it ethical for an information specialist or a publisher or someone who's not the creator of an item to entitle that item? I think it is. So I gave this a title, I made it up. Because I think, again, that naming is a powerful way to communicate what something is and to be able to find it later. And this image was a fun one to name. Every time I showed this to the guitar players, they would be like, oh, kisses. So it's like, okay, so this photograph is about kisses, and that has to go in the title. Oh, I wanted to talk about creator too. So the second element I have up here is creator, and I'm curious to know if you guys think that the Dublin core and metadata is specific enough in authorship, how it defines authorship. So the creator for a photograph would be the photographer, and is that implied already because the item is a photograph, or does that need to be narrowed down to a more specific role, labeling that role? And then the other things that I thought were really interesting for being able to find archival items in a digital environment were the format and the type. I imagine a researcher looking for information is going to be very concerned with what the genre is of the materials that they're finding and how that they can use that. And just as a very quick example, and then I'll wrap up here, this is an example of a set list that Leo Kottke made when he was performing, touring in Europe. And you can see I drew a little arrow to airproofing there. And he was, during this particular tour, he was promoting the continuous record. My feet are smiling. Here's an example of a clipping from a newspaper, and is this an advertisement, or is it what's the best language to define what exactly this is and where it comes from? And then to conclude here, if I can get to my final slide. So issues of fair representation, I think, are primarily ontological and semiotic. How do we communicate what things are through language, through symbols? And artists are making symbols of how they view their values and their worldview, and information specialists are making symbols on top of that. So symbols and symbols. Control who gets access to these types of things are ethical issues, especially when you go interactive and global. The more people who have access, the harder it is to control how things are being used. But I did like what Joe Tennis said yesterday in his keynote address about how we're not committed to keeping all of these systems forever. They're changeable, just like language changes. And as flexible people, and as people who can be open-minded and adapt change, I think that makes our profession pretty special. So thank you.
We have 10 minutes for questions about our two presentations. Come on, Jill, do it. I know you want to.
Always the questioner.
No, I'm out of blanks. Okay. Yes, go ahead. Okay.
With Kelly, it's very, very fascinating, and I just want to know a bit more about like subject access. I know you talked a little bit about that, but did you come up with your own like subject terminology, or did you try to pull from like LCSH or? Like,
I looked into using controlled vocabularies and standardized things, and I found them not to be very useful. So eventually, I don't know, since it's access so far is just the guitar department here, I don't know if they'll want to keep what I recommend for controlled vocabularies or not, but yeah, that's definitely an issue in ethical representation of
I
things.
find that fascinating, just like maybe how these users are actually searching for these things. I mean, especially for audio stuff, and I'm coming from a perspective also, because I have a lot of students from Dominican University in the Chicago area, and a lot of them work for the Studs Terkel radio archive. And I have them come and talk in my metadata class about how you really properly represent audio materials when there's so much kind of going on there that it's really kind of hard to verbally describe, especially using these particular control vocabularies, which are just not designed for like music and audio materials. Just the intangibility of that stuff. So that's, I think it'd be really fascinating to see kind of really how these users want to find this stuff, and then kind of then design like a vocabulary.
Right, yeah. I think how it is now is the people who are searching for things know the collection well enough that they rely on numbers a lot. So how they have things organized by dates and times, like how long clips are and things like that. So, yeah.
I also got a question for Kelly. Again, I really enjoyed this. I'm doing my own work looking at representation in the historic community archive. When you have like a photo, like the one with Stephen Paulus and Leo, and you're describing it, where do you get the information that says this is Leo, this is Stephen Paulus? Is that like on the photo? Do you have to research it yourself?
Mostly I asked John Strobes because he took the picture, and he's very knowledgeable about the collection. So all of that provenance and historical information, I have an excellent live resource to consult. Some research has to be done online. I unfortunately didn't have enough time to invest in filling out everything myself, but it's definitely something that will be done.
I have another question about that. When you're creating the titles, I noticed that I don't want to sound like a snot or something, privileged Leo Kottke because he comes first in the titles, but he's not first in the photo.
Yeah, that is actually something that I noticed yesterday when I was working on my PowerPoint. I was just like, oh, yeah, I wonder about that. Maybe I
So
should
there's
change the
something you would
order.
have to change, I mean, like, how much
Mhm.
does that matter? Because I'm not an archivist.
Yeah. Probably with photographs, you want to put it closest to the individual, the name closest, the order that they're in. So yeah, that's exactly what I was noticing is, oh, if that's not that person, I should change those. So.
Yeah, because I didn't realize that there's another metadata element that actually is used for description of exactly what's in the photo, or if the
Mhm.
title is really encapsulating that content.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing that I've been thinking about is if you get something like the title from the item itself, from the content, and you have a description of it, and you have a subject heading, like, is this redundant duplication of information? Like, do you really need to have all of that in the record? I don't know.
It would seem like you do.
Yeah.
You do need to have double. If it has a specific title and the people aren't in the order of the title,
Yeah.
you need to explain because otherwise someone who doesn't know these people will look at it.
Sure, not know who's who. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a very good point.
Tom, did you have a question?
It's a very interesting presentation, and not just because it's close to what I'm getting later on today. But I was really taken by your comparison, your side-by-side comparison of the different kinds of activities that parallel between what someone in IS does versus a creative musician. And that explains a lot. I've always, for years I've been curious about why there seems to be a disproportionate number of musicians among technical services staff. So maybe Richard has an idea about this.
Yeah, or maybe Lindsay. I was actually very curious, Lindsay, to ask you, in your work with oral tradition musics, do you use standard notation when you're teaching Irish fiddle?
The first thing I have to explain to my students is not to rely on standard notation because it's not at all reflective of how things are played, not even close. So it's very problematic for people who don't know how to realize this. I know it's a debate about performance practice, but it is also, an ethical issue of imposing one system of notation on something that simply can't be represented that way, like you were looking at tab.
Or does it privilege literate culture over oral culture?
Well, yes. Actually, what's funny is when James Kelli tries to hand out notation for things, oftentimes I'll look at it and he'll be putting things like F flats instead of natural, because he doesn't care. It just means lower this note rather than. So anyhow, yeah, it's mostly an oral